There's something about the wilderness that makes your skin crawl at night. Maybe it's the vast, endless darkness. Maybe it's the way the trees seem to whisper when the wind moves through them. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the feeling that you're not alone out there. Some campers return home with memories of crackling campfires and starry skies. Others never return at all. And those who do, they come back with stories. Stories about the things that watch from the tree lean, the footsteps outside their tents, the whispers in the wind that aren't really the wind at all. These are 5 true camping horror stories, disturbing, eerie, and impossible to forget. But be warned, once you listen them, you may never feel safe in the woods again. Still think you'd survive a night in the wild? Keep watching if you dare. The first night was peaceful. Ryan and Emma had been driving all day, winding their way through the remote Oregon wilderness until the road gave up and turned into dirt, then gravel, then nothing but forest. Miles and miles of towering pines, stretching endlessly toward a gray sky. They parked near an old trail and hiked another hour before finding the perfect spot. A small clearing by a narrow creek, far from any trails or campsites. It was exactly what Ryan wanted. Just us and nature, he said, throwing his arms out dramatically. No cell service, no people, no noise. Emma smirked as she unrolled her sleeping bag inside the tent. No bathroom, no shower. No way to call for help if we get eaten by a bear. Ryan chuckled, but he knew she wasn't entirely joking. Emma wasn't a big fan of the deep woods, but she loved him enough to come anyway. The first night was perfect. The fire crackled, the sky was full of stars, and the only sound was the whisper of the wind through the trees. They fell asleep in each other's arms, warm and safe, until Ryan woke up. A snap. Ryan's eyes fluttered open in the dark. He lay still, listening. Another snap. A branch breaking underfoot. He turned his head toward Emma. She was curled up, breathing softly, still asleep. Ryan frowned. Probably just a deer. Maybe a raccoon sniffing around for scraps. Still, something about the sound felt wrong. Too deliberate. Too slow. Carefully, he reached for the flashlight beside him. His fingers found the cold metal, and he clicked it on. The tent filled with a dim yellow glow as he unzipped the flap and aimed the beam outside. The trees swayed gently in the wind. The creek glistened under the moonlight. Everything looked normal. Then he saw him. A man, standing between 2 trees. Not moving. Not blinking. Just staring. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The man was maybe 30 feet away, partially hidden by the darkness, but Ryan could see his face. Pale. Hollow. His eyes, black pits in the night. "Hey," Ryan called, his voice tight. "Who's there?" No response. The man just stood there, his posture stiff and unnatural, like a mannequin someone had propped up in the woods. Ryan's pulse hammered. He gripped the flashlight tighter. "Hello." Still nothing. The wind shifted, rustling the trees, but the man didn't move. Didn't react. Ryan's stomach twisted. Something was wrong with him. The way he stood. The way he stared. The way he wasn't breathing. A cold dread curled around Ryan's spine. He wanted to wake Emma. Wanted to get up and run. But he couldn't move. Then, the flashlight flickered. For a split second, darkness swallowed the clearing. And when the light came back, the man was gone. Ryan sat frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. He swept the flashlight back and forth, searching the trees. Nothing. Had he imagined it? A trick of the light? A shadow? No. He knew what he saw. A shape shifted behind him. Emma stirred. "Ryan." Her voice was groggy, laced with confusion. "What are you doing?" Ryan's throat was dry. There was someone out there. Emma sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What?" "A man. Standing in the trees." Emma frowned. "Where?" Ryan turned the flashlight toward the spot where the man had been, but it was empty. Just trees and darkness. Emma groaned. "Babe, it was probably an animal." Ryan wanted to believe her. He really did. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Neither of them slept much after that. Emma dozed off eventually, but Ryan lay awake, gripping the flashlight, listening. The woods were too quiet. No insects. No wind. Just silence. Hours passed. Maybe. It was hard to tell. Finally, when the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Ryan unzipped the tent and peered outside. And then he saw them. The rocks. Small piles of stones. Dozens of them, arranged in a perfect circle around the tent. Ryan's stomach clenched. "Emma," he whispered. She stirred. "What?" "Come look at this." She crawled beside him and gasped. "Did you do that?" Ryan shook his head. Emma hugged herself, suddenly looking small and fragile. "Okay, let's go. Right now." Ryan didn't argue. They packed quickly, stuffing their gear into their backpacks with shaking hands. The forest pressed in around them, silent and heavy, like it was holding its breath. Ryan kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see that man again. And then, just as they were about to leave, Ryan made a mistake. He looked up, and he saw it, a pair of shoes, hanging from a branch. His heart stopped. Not just shoes. Feet. A body, dangling by a noose. Emma choked on a scream. The corpse was old, rotting. Its skin stretched tight over its skull, lips curled back in a sickening grin. Its clothes hung in tatters, barely clinging to its decayed frame. It swayed slightly in the breeze, the rope creaking. Ryan stumbled backward, while rising in his throat. And then he looked down. Footprints, leading away from the body. Fresh, like someone had been standing there all night, watching them. They ran. They didn't speak, didn't look back. They tore through the woods, branches slapping against their faces, their breath ragged with panic. When they finally reached the car, Ryan fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly he could barely fit them into the lock. The engine roared to life, and they sped away, kicking up dirt and leaves. Only when they were miles away did Emma finally whisper, "Ryan, was he real?" Ryan stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the wheel. He didn't answer, because he didn't know. Because some things, some horrors, they follow you, even after you leave the woods behind. It started with a bet. Mark and his three best friends, Danny, Chris, and Joel, had been planning the camping trip for weeks. They'd all been talking about escaping the city, about the mountains, the peace, the silence. The Appalachian Mountains were calling to them. No phones, no distractions, just the kind of weekend adventure that makes you feel alive. By late afternoon, they'd found the perfect spot. It wasn't on a marked trail, but it didn't need to be. The woods were dense here, an untamed stretch of trees that seemed to swallow the sun as the evening sky faded to a murky purple. They set up camp near a small creek, the gurgle of water a calming soundtrack to their efforts. Danny dropped his backpack on the ground and stretched, grinning. No cell service, no traffic, no work, just us and nature, boys. Chris cracked open a beer. And no one to bother us. He looked up, eyes scanning the trees. This is going to be perfect. Joel groaned as he wrestled with his tent. No one's going to believe we actually survived this weekend. Mark smiled, pushing up the sleeves of his flannel. Survive? We're just camping. How hard can it be? But as they set up their campfire and cracked open their first beers, Mark noticed something about the place. It was too quiet. The trees stood tall and unmoving, and though the air was heavy with the smell of pine, it felt wrong. Like the forest was holding its breath. Mark brushed it off, trying to chalk it up to nerves. They'd been in the woods before, and this was no different. "Tell me something, Mark." Chris leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "You ever hear about the whistling woman?" Mark rolled his eyes. "Here we go." Chris smirked, leaning in closer. "No, seriously. Some of the locals talk about her. Strange woman who used to live out here. They say she was murdered, and now her ghost haunts the woods, walking backward, whistling. A slow, eerie tune. Sounds like campfire ghost story crap," Joel said with a snort. "Come on, you guys are buying into that? Next, you'll tell me about Bigfoot." But Chris didn't laugh. Instead, his eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity. "You guys are too young to remember the old stories. The ones the locals used to tell around here. But I heard it from a ranger once. She was murdered by her husband, they say. Strangled right in the woods, but no one ever found her body. And now, she wanders these woods at night whistling. And if you hear her, Chris leaned back in his chair and smiled slowly. If you hear her, she's already found you. No thanks. Danny laughed nervously and took a swig of his beer. I'm good, man. Mark shook his head, trying to ignore the sudden unease prickling at the back of his neck. Dude, enough with the creepy stuff. It's just a story. But the story stuck with him. All night, as they sat around the fire and told their own versions of ghost stories, Mark couldn't shake the image of the whistling woman. Her bare feet, her tattered clothes, her hollow eyes. As the fire burned low and the others began to drift off to sleep, Mark's thoughts turned darker. Maybe it was the isolation of the forest, the stillness of the night. Maybe it was the cold wind that seemed to howl through the trees. But something didn't feel right. The woods felt too silent. Around midnight, as the fire flickered out, Mark sat up in his sleeping bag. His eyes flicked to the trees, the shadowed branches swaying in the wind. Then he heard it. A faint sound. A melody. A slow, eerie tune. At first, Mark thought it was just the wind, playing tricks on him. But then the whistling came again, clearer now. Closer. He froze, his heart pounding. It wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from deeper in the forest, beyond their campsite. The sound of the whistle twisted and bent on the wind, growing louder nearer. Mark swallowed. Did anyone else hear that? Joel mumbled something incoherent from his tent. Chris and Danny were fast asleep, unaware of the strange melody. But Mark couldn't ignore it. The whistling, sweet, sad, like a lullaby, filled the air around him. The wind seemed to carry it, weaving it through the trees like a secret. A voice calling him. He grabbed the flashlight by his side, unzipping the tent slowly. His mind raced, his breath shallow. What the hell was that? As he stepped outside, the cold hit him immediately. The air felt heavier, colder than it should have been for an August night. Mark turned the beam of the flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. The whistling stopped, and all that remained was the sound of the wind in the branches. Mark's heart was in his throat. Hello, he called into the dark, voice hoarse. Is someone there? The air remained still. Not a sound, not a rustle in the trees. His flashlight shook in his hand as he scanned the woods around him, the trees stretching into black nothingness. Nothing. It had to be some animal, maybe a bird. But why did it feel wrong? Then it came again. The whistling. Right behind him. Mark whirled, heart racing in his chest. His flashlight cut through the air like a blade, but there was no one. Not a soul. Mark? Came Danny's voice from behind him. Mark's throat closed up as he turned. Danny was standing in his tent door, looking confused. What's going on? Mark didn't answer. He stood frozen, staring at the spot where he had heard the sound, every hair on his body standing up. There was no one there, but the air felt wrong. The trees seemed to bend in on him. Then the whistling began again, closer this time. It wasn't a melody anymore. It was a warning. Mark's heart pounded as his flashlight swung wildly through the trees, but there was nothing. Nothing but the darkness. Finally, the whistling stopped. But something was different. The woods were too quiet now. The tension in the air was unbearable. Mark swallowed. Let's get inside. Now. They didn't sleep. By the time the first light of morning filtered through the trees, Mark, Danny, Joel, and Chris were awake, stiff, and nervous. They didn't talk. There was no need to. The dread from the night before had seeped into their bones. They packed up their gear quickly, tension thick in the air, their movements fast and stiff. Then Danny stopped. Guys, you need to see this. Mark followed Danny over to the edge of the campsite. His stomach dropped. Footprints. There were 4 sets. They circled their campsite, stopping just short of where their tents had been. But there was something wrong. The prints didn't have toes. They were perfectly formed heel prints, as if someone had walked backward, each step smooth and undisturbed, as though they had been there all night. That's not possible, Chris muttered under his breath. Mark's heart thudded as he looked around. Was someone else out here? But no. There was no sound, no movement. Just the trees. They were alone, but the footprints circled, and that meant someone had been watching them. A low whistle carried through the trees, distant. It was softer now, fainter, but still there. Mark turned, his legs shaking. Let's go. Now. They ran. They didn't stop until they were back at the car, doors slamming shut as they piled in. The ride out of the woods was silent, except for the sound of tires crunching over the gravel. No one looked back. They stopped at a gas station on the way out of town. Chris couldn't help himself. "You ever hear about the whistling woman?" he asked the old man behind the counter. The man's face hardened. He lowered his newspaper, eyes meeting Chris with a strange, knowing look. "You boys didn't go looking for her, did you?" Chris frowned. "We didn't mean to. It's just a story, right?" The man shook his head slowly. "The whistling woman? She's not a story, son. She's real. But she don't come for you unless you hear her. And once you hear her, it's already too late." None of them camped again after that. None of them spoke of it either. But late at night, when Mark lies awake, he still hears it. The slow, eerie whistle. And somewhere deep in the trees, he knows she's watching. Waiting. It had been a long day. Derek and his wife, Lisa, had spent hours hiking through the rugged terrain of the state park in Utah. The trail had been challenging, but the landscape was stunning. Mountains towering in the distance, the setting sun painting the sky with fiery orange and purple hues. They'd taken plenty of photos and shared a quiet, peaceful lunch by a stream. They were both exhausted, but in that way that made the day feel like it was worth it. As the night approached, they found the perfect spot to set up camp. Far enough away from the trail to avoid any other hikers, but close enough to the road that they could easily find their way back if needed. The fire crackled as Derek unpacked their gear, setting up the tent while Lisa arranged their sleeping bags inside. The air was cool, but not cold, and there was something comforting about the quiet hum of the forest surrounding them. "Feels good to sit down, huh?" Lisa smiled, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. Derek grinned back. "You said it. A cold beer and some sleep, and I'll be good as new." After a quick dinner of canned chili, they sat in silence, watching the fire flicker and listening to the gentle sounds of the night. Crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees, the wind sighing through the branches. It was the kind of evening that made them both feel like they were in the right place, together, away from the stress of everyday life. Lisa shivered slightly, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "You sure it's okay to camp out here? I mean, it feels kind of isolated." Derek shrugged, tossing another log on the fire. "We've camped in more remote places before. It's fine. Nobody's gonna bother us out here." Lisa nodded, though Derek could see the hint of uncertainty in her eyes. He reached out and squeezed her hand. "Hey, we're good. Don't worry about it." They both turned in early, crawling into their sleeping bags inside the tent. The fire outside began to die down, and the sounds of the forest grew fainter as they drifted into sleep. It was 3 a.m. when Lisa woke up. Her eyes shot open, her heart racing. The tent was still dark, the only sound the soft, rhythmic breathing of Derek beside her. But there was something else, something she couldn't ignore. The air outside their tent was thick with something. It wasn't the usual sounds of nature. No owls hooting, no breeze rustling the leaves. Just the sound of slow, raspy breaths, wet, almost labored, like something was choking. Lisa sat up, holding her breath. It was coming from just outside the tent. She could hear it clearly now, each inhale and exhale drawn in deep, desperate, as if something, was trying to get air but couldn't quite manage. "Derek," she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. Her voice trembled. Derek groaned, barely waking. "What is it?" "Listen." She pointed toward the tent wall, her finger trembling. "Do you hear that?" Derek's brow furrowed, still half asleep, but he sat up with a grunt. He didn't speak, just listened. At first, there was nothing, but then the breath came again. Wet, deep. It was definitely outside the tent, too close, as if whatever it was had moved right up to the fabric. He froze. "Shit," he muttered under his breath. Grabbing for the knife he always kept by his side while camping. His fingers tightened around the handle, and he unzipped the tent slowly, carefully, not wanting to make any noise. The air outside felt thick, oppressive, and cold. Derek's flashlight bounced off the ground as he stepped out, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. No movement. He turned slowly, scanning the area. The fire had long since burned out, leaving the camp in complete darkness. The trees stood tall and still. There was no sign of anything around them, not even a rustle of leaves. But the breath, it was still there, lingering in the air. A slow, steady rasp that seemed to come from every direction at once. "Lisa," Derek called, his voice low and tight with tension. "Stay in the tent." He turned, his eyes flicking to the edge of the campsite, then the trees behind it. There was no one there. No animals, no movement. Nothing. He stepped back, his pulse hammering in his chest. "It's nothing. I don't see anyone. Just the wind playing tricks on us." Lisa's voice was tight when she spoke. It didn't sound like wind. "I know," Derek replied, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't like it either. But it's fine." They both sat in silence for what felt like hours. Derek's mind raced, trying to dismiss the unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. They barely slept for the rest of the night, every sound, every crack of a twig, making them jump. Morning came too quickly. When the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Derek and Lisa both sprang out of their sleeping bags. Neither of them spoke. They packed their things quickly, tension hanging between them like a thick fog. It didn't help that the forest was still eerily silent, the usual morning sounds of birds and insects absent. They were almost done when Derek froze. He stood just outside their car, eyes fixed on the dirt around the vehicle. "What is it?" Lisa asked, walking over to his side. Derek's stomach churned. His fingers trembled as he pointed at the ground. There, scattered around the car, were handprints. Fresh, dark impressions in the dirt, as though someone had crawled to the vehicle in the night. But the handprints weren't like normal ones. They were too deep, too wide, like they had been pressed into the earth with unnatural force. Lisa's voice was barely audible. Who would do this?" Derek didn't answer. He couldn't. His heart hammered in his chest as his eyes scanned the area. The handprints led directly to their tent, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no traces of movement. Just the strange, chilling marks in the dirt. But that wasn't the worst part. It was the windshield. Derek's breath hitched in his throat as he turned toward the car. In the frost that had formed overnight, someone, or something, had written a single word across the glass. "Breathe." His body went cold. "Derek," Lisa whispered, clutching his arm. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," he said, his voice tight. He felt dizzy, lightheaded. He grabbed the keys from his pocket, his hand shaking, and they both got in the car, not looking back once. They didn't speak on the drive back. The miles felt endless, the silence between them more oppressive than anything they had felt in the woods. The memory of the breathing, the handprints, the word on the windshield, it all lingered in their minds, suffocating them. Neither Derek nor Lisa ever spoke about that night again. They never went camping after that. And sometimes, when they were alone in the quiet of their home, they would swear they could still hear it, the slow, raspy breath, like someone was waiting for them to breathe again. Ben had always loved the outdoors. Hiking, camping, the stillness of the woods. There was something about being deep in nature that gave him peace. He'd been to plenty of places, but this trip in Wyoming felt different. Maybe it was because of the remote location they chose. Far from the well-worn trails, tucked near a small, winding river. Ben and his cousin Jason had hiked all day, their bodies sore from the steep climbs, their spirits high as they laughed and talked about everything under the sun. The campsite was set by the water's edge, with the evening sky darkening into shades of purple and deep blue. They were both eager to unwind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they set up their tents, gathered some wood, and made a fire. The flickering flames danced in their eyes, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The air was cool, and the night sky, clear and full of stars, felt like it was stretching on forever. By the time the fire had burned down to glowing embers, they were both exhausted. The sound of the river flowing softly in the background was enough to lull them into sleep. They crawled into their sleeping bags, pulling them tight around their bodies to keep the night's chill at bay. The darkness seemed thick, almost oppressive, but peaceful. Just as Ben was starting to drift off, a sound sliced through the stillness. Zip. He blinked, confused. It sounded like a zipper being pulled open. He shifted, rubbing his eyes, and heard it again. Zip, zip, zip. Ben turned his head, looking over at Jason. Jason's eyes were wide open too, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" Jason whispered, his voice tight with unease. Ben nodded, his heart starting to beat faster. "Yeah, what the hell is that?" They both lay still for a moment, listening. The sound was unmistakable now, the slow, deliberate zip, like someone was unzipping a sleeping bag. But neither of them had moved. They both checked their bags. They were zipped up tight, just as they had left them. Zip, zip, zip. Ben sat up, his mind racing. He reached over to Jason, who was staring at the corner of the tent, his eyes wide with fear. "It's coming from outside," Jason said, barely above a whisper. Ben's skin prickled. He glanced around, his flashlight resting nearby. "Stay here," he whispered, and without waiting for a response, grabbed it and crawled out of the tent. The moment he stepped out into the night, the world felt different, darker somehow. The air was colder, heavier. He heard the river behind him, the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees, but the sound of the zipper, that was all he could focus on. He shone the flashlight across the campsite, his hands trembling. His light caught nothing but the tents, the fire pit, and the trees around them. Zip! There it was again, right in front of him, across the campsite. Ben's breath caught in his throat. Across the fire pit, in the dark shadows of the trees, something was moving. Something that shouldn't have been there. A sleeping bag stood upright, leaning slightly to one side. Ben squinted, trying to make sense of it. It didn't seem possible. It was swaying. His heart pounded in his chest, his throat dry. He took a step forward, the light from his flashlight flicking nervously across the campsite. The bag swayed again. Slowly, like something inside was shifting, trying to get out. Ben couldn't breathe. His stomach twisted into knots. The zipper. That's what had been making the noise. Someone or something was in that bag. His hand shook as he aimed the flashlight directly at it, holding his breath as he turned the beam on the strange figure. The moment the light hit the bag, it collapsed. The sleeping bag crumpled to the ground with a soft thud, as if it had been deflated, the way a balloon loses air. Ben didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed Jason's arm and pulled him out of the tent. "Run," Ben gasped, pulling his cousin along, not looking back. They didn't care about their gear, the fire, the tent. They just ran. Through the trees, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their hearts hammering in their chests. Every step felt like the ground was swallowing them, but they didn't stop. They ran until they reached the truck, their legs screaming with exhaustion, their eyes wide with fear. Ben fumbled for the keys, finally unlocking the door. They threw themselves inside, slamming the door behind them. The truck engine roared to life, and they sped off into the night, never looking back. The next morning, the woods seemed eerily quiet as Ben and Jason drove back to civilization. The bright morning sun did little to shake the dread that hung over them. Neither of them spoke for a long time, both too shaken to voice the horror they had experienced. It wasn't until they reached the ranger station that the words came out, spilling from their lips in a rush as they tried to explain everything. The ranger, a grizzled man with years of experience in the park, didn't say anything at first. He just stared at them, his expression unreadable. When he did speak, his voice was low, his face pale. "That's impossible," he muttered. "Nobody camps out there anymore. Not since the hiker." Ben and Jason exchanged confused looks. "The hiker?" Ben asked, his voice hoarse. The ranger took a deep breath. "A couple of years ago, a hiker went missing out there deep in those woods. They found his body a week later, in a sleeping bag, torn open from the inside. The words hung in the air like a cold wind. Ben felt his stomach drop. His mind raced as he tried to process what the ranger was saying. The story of the hiker, it fit. It explained everything. The zipper, the swaying sleeping bag. But what was in it now? The ranger didn't need to finish the story. Ben knew the truth. The thing they had seen, the thing that had haunted their campsite, had been the same thing that had killed the hiker all those years ago. It had come for them, and it wasn't done yet. The forest, the river, the mountains, they weren't just quiet. They were waiting. Josh had always looked up to his older brother, Mike. Mike was everything Josh wanted to be: strong, confident, and never afraid. They'd spent years hiking, camping, and exploring the woods. So when Mike suggested a weekend camping trip deep in the heart of the forest, Josh didn't hesitate to agree. The place they chose was remote, miles away from the nearest road, far from any other campers. It was the kind of place people didn't visit unless they had to, which, to Josh, made it perfect. It would be quiet, peaceful, just him and Mike, with nothing but nature surrounding them. The day had been long and exhausting, but by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, they'd set up camp. The fire crackled and popped, sending warm light flickering across the dark woods. They sat together, roasting marshmallows, laughing, and talking like they always did. But as the night wore on, the sounds of the forest began to fade. The usual chirps of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind, it all grew quiet. Too quiet. There was no wind, no rustling animals, not even the distant howl of a coyote. It felt like the forest had stopped breathing. Josh felt at first a tightness in the air, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. His spine prickled. Something wasn't right. He glanced at Mike, but his brother seemed unbothered, staring into the fire, lost in thought. Then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, a shadow moved. It was low to the ground, almost blending with the earth, creeping like something trying to avoid detection. Josh's heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his throat. "Mike," Josh whispered, his voice tight with unease. "Did you see that?" Mike blinked and turned his head, but by the time his gaze reached the spot, whatever it was had stopped moving. The area around them remained still, nothing more than the dark outline of trees and the soft glow of the dying fire. Josh's mind raced. Maybe it was an animal, some sort of nocturnal creature, trying to stay hidden. But it didn't look like any animal he'd ever seen. His eyes scanned the shadowy patch of earth, but there was nothing. Just the eerie quiet of the woods. "Maybe it was just a deer or something," Mike said, shaking his head and turning back to the fire. "You're imagining things." Josh didn't respond. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that didn't belong. He watched the darkness, waiting for any sign, any movement. Then it came again, a rustling, a soft scrape of something dragging along the ground. But this time it was closer. Josh could feel it now. It was coming toward them. His heart pounded as the figure reappeared, low to the ground, crawling on all fours. It was fast, far faster than any animal. The shape moved like it was gliding across the earth, its limbs jerking unnaturally. Josh froze, his blood running cold. The figure was low to the ground, just a shadow in the dark, but there was something about the way it moved that made his stomach churn. It wasn't walking. It wasn't even crawling properly. It was skittering like a thing that didn't belong in this world. He opened his mouth to shout at Mike, but the words caught in his throat. Mike didn't hear it, didn't see it. Not yet. The thing, whatever it was, stopped just beyond the firelight. Josh's breath was shallow, his hands trembling. He didn't know whether to run or hide or scream. And then it twisted its head toward them. Slowly, very slowly, Josh's blood turned to ice. The thing had a human face. A pale, emaciated face. Its skin was stretched too tight, like it had been pulled over bone, and its eyes, black, hollow, stared straight at them, as if it could see into their very souls. It didn't blink. It just stared, unblinking, with a look that was both predatory and something else. Something familiar. Josh's mind raced. Was it a man? A sick, twisted man crawling on all fours? Or was it something else entirely? Something that had taken the form of a person but was not human? Whatever it was wrong. Josh barely had time to process the horror of the thing before it disappeared back into the darkness. Without a word, Josh bolted to his feet, his heart hammering in his chest. "Mike!" Josh shouted, voice cracking. Mike looked at him, his face filled with confusion. "What? What's wrong?" "Get in the tent." "Now," Josh said, his voice trembling with fear. He didn't wait for Mike to respond. He grabbed his brother's arm and yanked him toward the tent, nearly tripping over his own feet. They crawled inside, breathless, and Josh quickly zipped it shut. Inside the tent, the sound of their hurried breaths filled the air, but everything else was silent. Too silent. Josh grabbed the knife from his backpack, clutching it in his sweaty hands. Mike sat on the other side of the tent, wide-eyed, his face pale. "I saw it," Josh whispered. "I saw it. There's something out there." Mike's voice was barely audible. "What do you mean? What was it?" Josh swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I don't know. But it had a face. A human face." The night passed in complete silence. They lay awake, both of them wide-eyed, straining to hear anything. The wind had died down, and even the occasional rustle of animals seemed to be gone. All they could hear was the pounding of their own hearts, the rasping breath of fear in the dark. Hours passed. It felt like days. Then, finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the trees, they dared to peek outside the tent. The forest was still, but the ground around their campsite was disturbed. There were scratches in the dirt, long and deep, as if something had dragged itself through the earth. And just outside the tent, in the spot where the creature had been, was a deep gouge in the soil, a mark that looked disturbingly like a human handprint. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. No more sounds, no more scratching. Nothing. They packed up without speaking. There was nothing left to say. Mike didn't ask about what Josh had seen. Josh didn't explain further. As they left the campsite behind them, the forest seemed to watch them, still, silent, and waiting. Years passed. Life moved on, as it always does. Josh grew older, his life taking him in different directions. He moved away from the woods, from the campsite, from the memory of that night. But there were times, late at night, when the world was quiet, and the shadows seemed to press in just a little too close. He could still hear it. The scratching. The voice that sounded just like his. "Let me in." Josh lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The memory had never left him. The thing, the face, the skittering thing in the woods. He wondered sometimes if it had never really gone. If it had just been waiting, biding its time, until the next time it would come for him. And when he closed his eyes, even now, sometimes he could hear it again. "Let me in."